I want to do tonight is I want to deal with assumptions. Felt that when you deal with certain things, like certain discussions, whatever it is, it's interesting on how often we have certain assumptions in any of our conversations with people, and we immediately assume that we just take it for granted that they're assumptions, and then we talk basically on that idea. And I think that so often in discussions and in Lima Torah, we assume things, and we don't really recognize that we're assuming things. I'm going to give you an example. It doesn't really fall Lima Torah, but it's a similar kind of type of concept. I was talking to a gentleman, actually sort of giving a small share, and I mentioned the fact that I wanted to start talking about a similar topic, like about assumptions, in terms of the shift that has occurred, that I felt has occurred in terms of people's attitudes, let's say, towards orthodoxy, where it used to be that people talked about the Orthodox as being more religious. Where I grew up, which is in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, most people weren't Shomer Shabbos. The vast majority of people weren't Shomer Shabbos. There was an attitude that, the religious, that's right. So I'm not sort of saying, well, I'm weak, that's why I'm not Shomer Shabbos. Whether they believed it or not, but that's sort of the attitude. There was a yardstick. The yardstick was you should be religious, and most people had the yardstick that they weren't. And I took it as like a weakness, or certainly they weren't keeping to the correct standard. That has changed nowadays. Nowadays, people as they what do you call it? Divert away from mitzvot, stop following, like take stands against the mitzvot, doing so because they argue this is the correct value. In other words, the Orthodox are wrong in their values, and we are presenting the right value. Okay. Which is a very, very different perspective. So the fact is that beforehand, everyone used to, this was the yardstick. At least this is what everyone gave lip service to being the yardstick. Jewish law or whatever. Some people abide by the vast majority didn't, but they felt there was a yardstick. That was the yardstick. Now, what's in contention is the yardstick. People no longer are, and they're not just not doing it because they're weak or because they have this interest or they couldn't be bothered, but they're all doing it on principle. It's wrong to do that. And one example is this is with circumcision, with Mila. In terms of how many people now start taking stands, I will not circumcise my child, like almost like a shita within their own yardstick. And I brought this up this year because it was a case I heard of a woman who basically is pregnant and sent around, I think 5 months pregnant, and sent around a not a religious woman, coming from a Reform background or whatever, but still, her parents or her family really, believes in Mila or whatever, not anything else but that, and she sent around an email message to all her friends that she's not going to circumcise her son. Sort of bothered her father a little bit, so forth and so forth, but that was it. This has nothing to do with halacha. This woman was not a halacha Jew for her, but she took the stand that now I'm taking a stand. I won't circumcise my child on principle. Right. So Alex writes that he has a case like that in his own family. Anyways, what happened was at the shiur, a man said the exact same thing. He had a case like that with a niece of his. That he heard the niece was pregnant and found out it was going to be a boy, and she wasn't going to circumcise the boy. So this man phoned up his niece and tried to give her an argument why she should circumcise her son. And the man basically gave this. So he started off with an argument on medical grounds, right? That it's medically called for, whatever. Less cancer of the cervix. Less cancer of the cervix is less. The greater hygiene as people get older. For the man, whatever. But anyways, that was his argument. And she rejected it. Says other argument medically, and I said, you know what happened with this argument? I looked at him and said, really, is that why you are pro-circumcision? You're not pro-circumcision because of the medical arguments. You're pro-circumcision because of your Jewish traditional viewpoint. Now, this man was not just Shomer Shabbos, but Mila is like that's very important Jewish tradition. Kasha Shabbos, not, but okay. That was your argument. And and your niece, is she really arguing that she doesn't want to circumcise her child because of medical reasons? Or is it some other reason? Maybe she's trying to make a statement. So I brought that up. And my point I was going to get to was how we look at yardsticks and how we apply yardsticks. But what really comes down to is the issue of where we get the yardsticks from. Our yardsticks. And that's what's so... Hi, how you doing, Angel? The fact is we really get yardsticks. And we apply those yardsticks. And it's a question where we get those yardsticks from, but there's also a question of knowing our yardsticks and knowing as we're talking to someone who is applying a different yardstick and understanding how to talk to someone across the yardsticks, across the differences. Now, the truth is there are people who say that they don't even want to do that. There are people who say that if they talk to someone who's not religious or whatever, they'll talk to the person with the assumption that they all agree that the right thing to do is to follow halacha. So the way some people actually talk to others is by saying, hey, we all, it's almost like it's a given that this is the halakha, it's given that this is right, it's given so forth and so forth. And sometimes that works. Sometimes people do it. Other times, and it's very strange, is people sort of look at this and they sort of nod their head, and already by definition, they're already out of the picture because they know that they're being imposed upon by the yardstick. So the question is our assumptions in talking to someone else, knowing where they're coming from, and knowing how we should converse with them, knowing how we should cross the divide of different yardsticks. And that's sort of what I want to talk about in terms of looking at our assumptions. And then from looking at our assumptions, where we go from there. And one assumption is, when we talk to the Jews or whatever, it's the assumption that being Jewish is significant, is important. And many of us don't even recognize that assumption. I find that this is one of the big issues with assimilation, for example. Someone who's very much against assimilation, very much against intermarriage, will talk to someone assuming that it's a given that it's important for the Jewish people to exist. It's a given that there should be Jewishness in the world. And they talk to someone else putting it aside, how can you do this? Like, how can you marry outside the faith? How can you marry this? Because, look, there's 5,000 years of Jewish tradition, and it's very important for it to be around, and so forth and so forth. But it's almost like, like they bring the argument of what's going to happen to the Jewish people. It's very important that with the assumption that it's very, very important for the Jewish people to be around. One of the things that's interesting about this is that the fact is that a lot of people, especially people who are about to intermarry, one of the fundamental things is, do they even agree with that assumption? Do they really think it's even important that Jewish people be around? You know, and that's something a lot of us don't recognize. That original assumption. Okay, the assumption, is it important for Jewish to be around? Why is it significant for Jewishness to be around? Why is it important? We have an assumption of it being important. And that becomes a very interesting thing. If you look at a lot of ways that people relate to things, they usually build upon assumptions. And a lot of times when they present things to others, they build upon the assumption because there are other people who have that assumption without really knowing it, or it touches a chord in them, and they try to highlight that assumption. You see, one of the problems that exists when you talk about what your assumption is and so forth, is that you lose the ability to sort of get across your point in a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Clandestine way. See, if you're talking to someone who is about to intermarry, and you start talking to him in a way that says, it's important for Jewish to be around. The person may not have even thought of that before. Or the person might have in the back of his mind, I wanted to marry a Jew, but okay, didn't find one, okay. But the fact is, if you make that assumption, you've already got the person in your ballpark. You're coming across that assumption as a given. And by not giving the person the chance to even think about why do you assume this, you're actually having a conversation with that person with this assumption. So in a clandestine way, you may, make your point, or you may score points, or you may get across some idea by just ignoring any other assumption. Just not going there. Just assuming that the assumption is the assumption you want to exist. And that works. That does work at various points in time. But is it totally intellectually honest? Okay, that's one question. Point is it also a way to is it always work? Sometimes the fact is that it may work with some people, but with other people you have basically ensured that you will not get your point across. Because the person just in his own mind says, okay, you have an assumption, I ignore that assumption, therefore I won't even go on. So the point is that if you're trying to actually make a point, you have to see when is it worthwhile to make and have to discuss the assumption, where is it not worthwhile to discuss the assumption, but I have something else. I'm talking in terms of intellectual arguments and so forth and so forth. It's very, very important to look at your assumptions and see what you are discussing with the other vis-a-vis these assumptions. And bring them down to brass tacks. So, for example, with the whole thing of intermarriage and so forth, I take it for granted that it was important for the Jewish nation to exist, for Jewishness to be in the world. But confronting these type of questions, I really had to deal with the question of this assumption. Why do I think it's important for Jewish people to be in the world? Why do I think it's important for Jewish in the world? And then I take it one step further. I'm not just talking about Jewishness that is halakhic Jewishness. What about non-halakhic Jewishness? Okay, and that's a further question. Is it important for Jewishness to exist in terms of modern day Jewishness, which is not necessarily halakhic? And then it gets into questions, what do you mean by Jewishness? But the fact is that these are all come about with the assumptions. But the point is, in many ways, once you believe in Torah Misinai, once you believe that God already said it's important for Jews to exist, and that ends the discussion.
But the point is, a lot of times you have your assumption because you assume that Torah Sinai. You believe in divine revelation that gives credence to your beliefs. Well, one of the interesting things is how do you talk to someone who doesn't necessarily believe in Torah Sinai? Well, maybe that the assumption you have there is the assumption that the person does believe in Torah Sinai. So you talk to someone who's totally not observant, doesn't get well, and you talk about the Jews leaving Egypt, and you talk as a given that God gave the Torah in Sinai. And you don't even give the opportunity for a person to think, well, I don't really believe that. And already, once you start getting into that, you're already moving into a methodology. But the welcome is that you get some results from this argument. But the point is are you really being intellectually honest? What I mean by that, are you really being intellectually sound in the arguments? See, what happens when you get to assumptions is you begin to question your own assumptions. Like, okay, take it as a given, Torah Sinai. Well, why do you take it as a given, Torah Sinai? Why do you take it as a given that there was a revelation? These are very powerful questions when you look at your assumptions. So, let's look at this for a sec. What are your originating assumptions? Maybe someone in the WEB SHIUR wants to just type in something about one's assumption. I should just explain to the kosher tube people that the SHIUR is a WEB SHIUR on virtual yeshiva, and there are people who participate, and while they can't talk, they can type in things. So sometimes during the SHIUR I'll read what one of them has written, and also I'll pose questions to see if they want to respond to it. So I want to see if someone in the WEB SHIUR wants to look at one of their assumptions and see if they want to go back to see where that assumption comes from. So far I'm not getting any takers. Okay. Well, I like to get something, and that is the significance of Jewishness. See, I think that's a big assumption that's taken in the world, and it really colors our whole approach to intermarriage and assimilation. Our argument is there something wrong with assimilation and intermarriage because something wrong with Jews not being around. There's a value in Jewishness continuing. The fact is sometimes a lot of people don't recognize where does that value come from. Okay, I'm going to try and pick it up a little bit. Okay, I'm getting a little thing about about sound. Well, it seems that my microphone was down low for the WEB SHIUR. Is that better now? Okay, that should be better. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so you go up to someone and you say, we've been around for 5,000 years. Isn't it important for Jewishness to continue? Do you want to be responsible for the end of the Jewish people? And the assumption is, wow, it's important for the Jewish people to continue. Well, why? Why? Where does that assumption come from? Why should someone who doesn't care about Jewishness, willing to intermarry, why should he care if the Jewish people continue or not? You go up to him and say, "Oh, wow, you're taking a step away to the continuation of Jewish people around for 5,000 years, 3,000 years, whatever. You've been around for millennia. You don't want to be responsible for this to end, right?" That sounds like a nice little argument. Why? What's the assumption? Why? Fact is that, let's give you an example. We drive cars today. They used to have horse and buggies in the 1800s. Can you imagine going up to someone who discovered the combustible engine, that drives cars? You're driving the car. Your creation of this motor is going to mean the end of the horse and buggy. It's going to be the end of horses being part of our daily existence. Do you want to be responsible for that? Right, we'll change our whole culture. No longer will have horses. Okay, so no horses. So what? So? See, if you're going to argue that, wow, this is important for Jewishness to be around, why? Maybe it was a nice thing for some time in the past, but who says that it has to be in the future? It was nice when they had horses. No, we don't need horses anymore. We have something better. So maybe it was nice that Jewish people were around for those years. Now we're moving into a new age, and maybe with this new age, there'll be a new structure of humanity that doesn't need a Jewish nation. The fact is no one ever questions that. We immediately go out there and start talking to people and say, hey, this is a given assumption. And we don't recognize that our assumption is really based upon our own personal feelings. Because we personally find meaning in being Jewish. We personally find some type of identity in being Jewish. Therefore, we think it's important for Jews around. But someone who's going to marry obviously doesn't feel that this identity is so significant. Yeah, it was nice. It was nice. It brought morality to the world. Okay, so now the world's moral. Yeah, when people were barbarians, it was good to have a bunch of people who weren't barbarians. Now, everyone's not a barbarian, so we can relate. It's really significant when we get down to those assumptions. Now, a lot of times, the assumptions do take you back to Torah and to Kodesh Baruch Hu and to God. It takes you back to that point because the starting point, if you believe in the starting point of Torah Sinai, of God giving value to Jewishness, then that really explains the assumption. The question is how you develop assumptions without that. And that's something that most people don't want to recognize. Especially in the world that we're in right now, where we sort of want, it's sort of like we want to be pluralistic, and we want to, welcome all people, all Jews sort of equally. We want to be welcoming, and so forth and so forth. And in many ways, we don't recognize that one of the limits of pluralism is the fact that without a real commitment to the divine origins of Torah and of Jewishness, that you really start having questions of why it's significant for this group of people to be around. Think about that. The fact is we don't really want to go further into our assumptions, because when you go further in assumptions, you begin to see the world as much more complex. And we see the results of that. We see the results of that in Eretz Yisrael, where one of the issues in Eretz Yisrael is, why do you need a Jewish state? We don't think about this and so forth. We see a lot of things like this, but the fact is that if you follow what's going on in sort of like public opinion, sort of, especially like in the world, what you begin to recognize is the issue is moving from an issue of a Jewish state to an issue of a democratic state. I saw something on CNN recently, like they come across like a big chiddush, but it's not really a big something everyone knew. But all of a sudden, that if you really add up all the Jews and all the Arabs in Greater Israel, 50% of the population is Jewish, 46% of the population is Arab, and therefore the Arab the Arab birth rate is greater than the Jewish birth rate. So the question is, demographics are pointing to the fact that if you want to maintain democracy,
you're going to have a challenge to a Jewish state because more than 50% of the population is not going to be Jewish. So that's a real issue. Yeah, I mean, assuming that you want to be democratic or whatever. But that becomes part of this thing. So it's when you're looking at this, and you see Israelis wanting to be like Westerners and talking about Western values in America. I mean, like, let's say, non-observant Israelis who really pride themselves on being a Western democratic country. Basically, the question of a Jewish state becomes inherently a challenge. Okay, I'm just going to just going to read what Alex writes here. But there is no agreement among Jews what a Jewish state is. Not surprising, since for thousands of years they do not have any practice in running a state. That's true, Alex. But what's really at the core of that question is no understanding of what Jewishness is. The term Jewish. A lot of these things really highlight a lot of things that people don't want to recognize. You see this, like, for example, I think it's very, very hard to promote Jewishness without a core belief in Torah Sinai. I think it really is difficult. And yet everyone's trying to be Jewish and trying to be pluralistic and so forth and so forth, but it really becomes difficult. Because for you to say it's significant for people to be Jewish, and then in our world, people are moving away from nationalistic identity, from these type of subgroupings. If you say that people should only, Italians only want to be Italians, that's considered to be racist. And the fact is all human beings are the same. So the truth is, if you're going to argue that there's a significance of Jewishness, you have to have a reason for it. And this becomes, and ultimately, God becomes a pretty good reason. But this is an example of what happens with assumptions. So people talk that way. You see, if you talk to someone assuming Torah Sinai, the person doesn't have to confront what they believe. They just buy it. Okay, and it just sort of goes along. If you actually confront them, then they have to look at it and say, gee, do I really believe in this? Do I really think this is significant? So therefore there's a certain benefit, in a logistic benefit. Okay? Okay. Now, Alex writes, well, the idea that all people are the same is a very recent politically correct invention. It is a purely ideological statement. That's absolutely correct. But that's what we're dealing with right now. People have this assumption. And even in that assumption, all people are the same, how many people actually ask what that means? Is it really true all people are the same? Is Albert Einstein really the exact same as me? I don't think so. I think he had a little different brain than I did. Okay? Oh, so Angel argues we may be equal but not the same. What does the equal mean? What does real equal mean? Okay? What does that mean? Is it true that everyone's equal? American citizens, there are a lot of people arguing American citizens that illegal aliens should not be equal to American citizens in the States. A lot of people are arguing that right now. Okay? Oh, so Angel says equal in the sight of Hashem. Yes, Hashem becomes when you bring God into it, then you can understand what you're saying, because God does it. But even they're equal. Are you saying all Jews are equal? Or you say all human beings are equal? What exactly does that mean? Okay? Alex writes, well, I'm not sure that most people actually believe it, and that is, I think, easily proven by the reaction of people when someone who's different tries to marry into their family. Yeah, it's part of it. But the fact is we're becoming more and more tolerant about that. This is where it gets, once you get down to the assumptions. See, part of that assumptions is really looking at definitions. Like Angel's statement equal in the sight of Hashem. What does that mean? Is everyone equal in the sight of Hashem? Jews, non-Jews. Well, no. Well, what about all Jews? Are Levim and Kohanim equal to regular Jews? Bringing the issue of men and women even throw into that. The question of what is equal mean? Then you get the classic equal but different. Well, that gets back into the whole issue in the United States of separate but equal. Well, is that really equality? That was the whole issue of Brown versus Board of Education, right? See, once you get to assumptions, then you ask for the definitions of words. Okay. Well, you see, I get. What is your assumption? And Angel, who says you know better than anyone else? Is there no way that you are better than anyone else? I think that person who wins a gold medal at the Olympics is better than someone else in a specific field. So you're saying no better than anyone else. Better in what? I'm sorry. I'm sort of trying to work on these things. I see. Cheryl's back. She left and came back. That's good. See, the truth is with assumptions you start getting into playing with words. I mean, I become Socrates in a certain way, and once you start asking those kind of questions, basically you're basically putting yourself in mortal danger, as Socrates did, because you're making people ask what they really mean. And that's really what occurs with assumptions. I mean, the point is you're really getting people to say, okay, what do you really mean by that? And really to the core root, what is your assumption? Now, as I said, I always think that in many ways, any assumption within Jewishness eventually is going to have to get back to God. That God distinguished the Jewish people. Especially in our politically correct world of today, that doesn't like any aspects of differences. But I mean, that's part of the issue. But no one has thrown out an assumption. Well, Angel did in terms of saying aspects of equality, but those assumptions are so significant, and we build upon the assumptions. See, I'll tell you something that I believe very strongly. I really believe that the different paths in Torah, right? We talk about Shivim Panim LaTorah, 70 faces to Torah, different paths for different people. It all starts with the original assumption a person has coming into Torah. See, the assumption precedes your experience with Torah. When you come to Torah, you're assuming something. You're making assumptions about relating to God. You're making assumptions about a lot of things. And assumptions, that originating assumption will color how you then progress within Torah. So the truth is that in certain ways, it's not just to prove an assumption right or wrong. It's an aspect of finding that assumption and see where you're going with it. And actually watching how you're progressing in this. And you can really see that by figuring out your assumption that led you to the Rabbi that you're going to learn with. Because the Seilach HaRav is you make that choice. You're not asking someone for a psak of who should be a Rabbi, because who are you asking? Okay, now Alex writes, well, number one assumption that God exists, the Torah has some connection to it, that is a pretty big assumption right there. Right, so it's worthwhile investigating that assumption. Right? So what does that mean? And why do you make that assumption? And maybe they make that assumption because you're Jewish. It might be that, it's just in my psyche that I make that assumption. It's not a proven assumption, it's an assumed assumption. And then you work from there. And maybe you figure out some answers of why it makes sense there. But once you understand that assumption, you know where you're going. And the fact is, you open up. What I'm trying to say is, by finding the assumption, it's not just
to be able to critique, you also find out what path you're going on, what you are really trying to do. By the way, this is one of the things with the whole Hakeda of Avraham Avinu. Why it becomes so significant is because the assumption about HaKadosh Baruch Hu that Avram was trying to teach all the world was that God cared. The uniqueness of the monotheistic God was that God cared. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes and says, go sacrifice Yitzchak. Through everyone. But then Avram had to recognize and say, well, might be that my original assumption was not so. I have to go ahead. That was it, because he had to go ahead and say, I am going to follow Kosh Baruch Hu because the challenge is my assumption of him. Okay, so Alex is going to respond to his assumption of why he assumes Torah is, that there's a God and there's something to do with Torah. So Alex says, I presume I make this assumption because in my mind the alternative, that there is no God, or that even if he is real, we cannot possibly know anything about him, is too painful for me to contemplate as a possibility. And okay, so the fact is basically, you're saying this is an assumption that allows me to live, and that may be it. Okay. Now, Angel writes, I must admit that I have contemplated very often the possibility, and it's not painful for me. So basically, the assumption. Okay, but Angel says, I need truth, whatever it is. So basically saying the truth matters. Well, is truth even possible? Alex says, well, I have to make an assumption because I can't face the other possibility. The point is, they're saying things about themselves, but they're also saying things about reality, about how we make decisions and how we deal with aspects and how we come to assumptions. And we can get into the issue what do we mean by painful, not painful. See, the truth is that let me point out something too, with the assumption of God. And this is something that is so hard for most people to recognize, is the own limits of our comprehension. The truth is whether you're an atheist or a theist, you have to accept something which is incomprehensible to you. Okay? What is the real argument for God? Argument for God is, if you're talking about the first cause and so forth and so forth, we live in a world of cause and effect. So we ask the question, where did everything come from? There's got to be something that was the cause to this effect of the world existing. What does it mean when we say we believe in God? We believe in a cause that is outside the realm of cause and effect. Now, it's really what you're believing in God is you believe in an entity that is not by the parameters of this existence, because this existence works and has a world of cause and effects. What you're assuming is that there was an entity which which exists outside the realm of cause and effect that was the cause for this effect of the creation of the world. But the fact is that entity is by definition incomprehensible, because we cannot comprehend something that was created out of nothing, or we can't comprehend something that does not have a cause and effect. So the fact is that as a theist, you have to conclude that there's a certain aspect of existence that just doesn't make sense. Now, the challenge of atheists is they say, well, the problem there is they have to accept where did life come from. So they have a problem with not having that first cause and not being able to explain the uniqueness of life. So, but the problem there is that they work within the realm, but they're saying within this realm that I can only comprehend cause and effect. there's something that didn't have cause and effect. Well, that's a problem. But we're postulating also that there's something that didn't have that lives outside the realm of cause and effect. But we're postulating that it is an entity that is not bound by this reality. In fact, created this reality. When you get into these things, it becomes very, very powerful. Now, the truth is that I happen to think that the idea of atheism is extremely painful. But the fact is that the idea that there was a cause in a realm that only exists with cause and effect, to me, is a problem. Therefore, I accept the fact that the cause must exist outside these parameters of cause and effect. Anyways, but this whole, but Angel's point, I need to know truth, but how do we really know truth? You see, this is what happens when you really get into the issues of assumptions, definitions, so forth. Get right to the core. Okay, I'm just going to give up the mic if someone wants to say something, and then I'm going to call it an evening. Okay? Okay. Good night, everyone. I'm saying good night to the kosher two people, but okay?